Hi, welcome to the April 1st meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. At today's meeting, we're going to try an experiment, an idea Miles came up with, where we're calling this meeting, Bring Us Your Problems. Now, you can bring up any problems you've been having, also things that maybe aren't quite problems, feature requests, questions, just inquiries as to where you might find things in the documentation. Anything is open. So any users having questions, comments, problems, issues, whatever, bring it on. Because this is kind of ad hoc, I can't promise that we'll be able to solve every problem in this meeting. We'll try. And those that we don't get solved, we'll queue up to address either asynchronously in the Slack channel or at a future meeting. But I think we've got a lot of talented people here. I can see on the attendee list that we've got people with pretty strong backgrounds in various issues. And some of the people who joined the call are kind of routinely helping users out on the Slack channel. So I think we've actually got a lot of brain power here on the call. With that said, does anybody have anything to bring up? Also, if anybody's a first timer to this group, you're welcome to introduce yourself or ask questions about, what happens at these meetings or what this is about.
By the way, I also noticed that we have a couple of the CSI, CNS development team on here as well. So if you need anything to sort of jog your thought processes or things that you might want to bring up, if you have any comments on, CSI, CNS, any of that kind of stuff as well, I'm sure they would love to hear it too.
Just so that we don't face dead air, I was policing the Slack channels for questions. In my mind, a great place to ask your questions on running Kubernetes in VMware is this group's Slack channel. But I think people don't necessarily know that, particularly newbies. So you find them in the channel for the cloud provider, as well as in CSI sometimes if they're storage related. And a lot of people ask questions in Kubernetes-users. Now, my advice there is if it's specific to one cloud provider, that's not a real great place because there's so much churn in that channel that it can get hundreds of messages a day, so that a lot of the devs who might be the best sources for helping people out on issues just don't have the time to read something as chatty as that, but yet they do routinely occur there. And I noticed one this morning that I don't know immediately the answer here, but maybe somebody else does. Somebody was saying that they were using a CSI volume mount with a storage class and attempting to use XFS on that volume mount. And they found that that didn't work, even though using ext4 did. And I believe in that message, they did, on the basis of the log file, it looked like they might have been using vSphere. So does anybody here know of what a potential resolution is? Do they have to install in the Docker image the XFS file system, for example, to cause that to happen? Or is that an issue related to the CSI driver itself? I don't actually know myself, but I did notice that inquiry.
Yeah, so regarding the XFS file system, we used to have that package installed as part of the base driver image, but we have removed that package from 2.0 as we didn't tested the XFS file system. So looks like the customer is hitting into the issue while using the XFS file system, because the package itself is not available, so you can't format the file system with the XFS.
Okay, so just so I understand, the way this happens is that when you provision a PV using a storage class, it's up to the CSI driver to have code in there to do that formatting. Is that right?
Yes, when you try to use that volume into a pod, at that time the file system will be created. And since the node daemon set doesn't have the package to format this file system, XFS file system, that's where the failure happens.
Okay. Are there any possible workarounds for that?
So we have asked customer to create an SR, and we are interacting with our PM to add a support for that in the future vSphere CSI driver releases.
Okay. I'm just wondering if it would be possible while you're waiting to perhaps, if the volume actually gets created, maybe you could mount it somehow and manually format it, if that would actually work. If it were a one-time only thing, that might get you, might get you a temporary workaround.
I don't think temporary workaround is available for XFS file system. You may use other file system, although ext 3, 4, another.
Yeah.
There you go. I sent into chat, there is a GitHub issue created for it on the CSI driver page as of February, I think. Yeah, 24th of February, asking for XFS file system support. I think the challenge is some of the applications have a requirement on XFS, like some apps actually just use features of that file system that only exist in that file system. I think there's some IBM apps that people are running that have that kind of weird clustering thing going on. So I think there's some applications just hard require that, which is, I'd never come across it before, to be honest, but yeah, apparently it's a thing.
It's probably good for us to aspire to have in the documentation maybe a list of the file systems we do support and those we don't, just to save people from having to go out there with inquiries on each of these. There's probably a short list of these things that people are actually likely to use, but when it comes to Linux, the list of potential file systems is potentially really long, I think. Some of them might be quite obscure, but they're out there. Another thing that I know has come up in the past with regard to file systems is using raw block mounts, because there are some pieces of software that don't try to use any file system at all. I'm thinking some of these databases figure that the file system is just additional overhead so that they can engage in raw IO to get to a volume. Is anybody here authoritative on that subject as to whether CSI currently has support for raw volume mounts? Or I think they call them raw block mounts.
Yeah, we have a code in place in the vSphere CSI driver to use the raw block volume, but we haven't validated it, so we are not declaring a support for that. The code is there in place, available if you want to try it out, but the feature is not declared as a GA for production use because we haven't validated end-to-end on the scale and performance level.
Okay,
yeah,
that's good
I
to know.
It has worked for me with Aerospike, which requires a raw block. So it does work, even though it's not GA from our testing.
Do we run the E2E test? If we run E2E test, then it does exercise raw block also.
So the existing E2E test cases are not using the proper pod spec to skip that file system format. So we have to use the special parameters. So those test cases are not available in the E2E test cases currently we have on the repository.
What does that mean that they don't skip the file system format? Does that mean it gets formatted anyway, even though somebody is going to ignore the format?
No, the test cases need to have a special parameter so that we understand that this is a block. We want to present this volume as a block and don't want to create a file system on it. So,
okay.
So cases doesn't have that parameter yet.
Does anybody know if we've got a GitHub issue or something already existing to advance this forward? It seems like if Scott is reporting that it actually seems to work with Aerospike, that we shouldn't leave this like lingering in an undocumented state for years, but actually try to push this forward, get the thing in the test suite, and advance it as a published feature.
So I want to add one bit of information here. So when we are building CLS and CSI, so we are building it together. And the way we work internally in VMware is we actually go through a proper qualification so that we can do enterprise grade support for our customers. So it's like a lot of things as a developer, we can just quickly say, yeah, it is working fine. But when we say it is not supported, what I really mean is it has not gone through the full qualification that all the other features go through within VMware. So things like raw block volumes, we know it works, but we need some qualification time for that. Then the other feature we talked about, the XFS support, I think that should be simple, very simple to add support. But again, that it has to go through a complete systems test. We have FET, and then we have performance. So I'm just trying to give an idea, like when we say something is not supported, but it is there, it basically means that our team need to do a lot more work to pull in that feature. It's not just developers just saying it is there.
Okay, that sounds fair. I mean, I don't want to advertise things we haven't tried, but still, if it's possible, I'd like to have it available so that a user could maybe do some kind of query to see that it's in the pipeline, or that it's at least feasible and people have tried it. And I'm open to other ideas, but maybe one way to do that is to just put it in as a GitHub issue, because at least people could search for it then and find that there's some evidence that, you know, there's at least experimental support for it,
right,
or not.
Or add it as like an alpha feature in the feature sets of the CSI drivers.
I think that's something that we very much underutilize actually in all of our open source projects at VMware, is the alpha beta tag stuff, because we always have been in the mindset of you ship something and it's GA. Like there was never really an alpha phase for anything vSphere. So I think we're still sort of getting past that, you know, and making it okay for ourselves to ship alpha stuff. Though one thing I'll just add to what you were saying, Steve, I know the guys have done a ton of work over the last while, and I think as of 2.0, all development on CSI is done in the upstream repo. I don't know, you know, if all the issues are necessarily in the upstream repo, but I know all dev work starts there. So it's always like the latest version of what we're working on is on GitHub.
Okay, it sounds good. So, you know, we've got an action item to maybe make this stuff a little better in terms of user visibility, and issues might be a good way to do that, or alpha beta tagging, or a little of each. You know, it seems like issues are a good way before it even gets to the alpha state to at least clue people in that it's somebody's at least looking at it. And maybe if you're finding a problem, you're not the first one there. I'd also encourage users to, this is just generic to all of Kubernetes, that, you know, I certainly encourage you to put the inquiry on Slack, but Slack is really lousy for searching for developers who want to address things. And nobody is offended by you creating an issue. They can always be closed if it turned out it was just, you know, some misunderstanding. But please go ahead and create one for pretty much anything you run into. That's just the way it's intended to work on Kubernetes. So that is how we track things, and that's how you get things looked at and fixed, whether it's a code issue or a documentation issue.
Yeah, I was just trying to look like if you have a issue file for raw block volumes. With XFS, I found it, but not for raw. Maybe you should just file an issue and track it.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, does anybody else have anything they want to bring up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, since we got started, there was a few more people that jumped on the call. And just to clarify, because they missed what you were saying at the beginning, Steve, this is kind of just an experimental VMware clinic. So if you have any problems or questions or feature requests or otherwise, feel free to just, open them up here and we can have a chat about them and see what we can do.
I think the one other thing just regarding CSI that came up is the feature compatibility matrix between the different versions doesn't seem to have been updated since 7 update 2 with the changes that were made there. It's only still on 7 update 1. So I think if I remember correctly from the blog post, there's online volume expansion in 7 update 2. And that is not anywhere in the CSI documentation. That's only in the release blog posts and whatnot. So that should probably be updated as a new column in the table.
I'll let the CSI guys comment on what the status is on documentation update, but I know that we're doing quite a large refactor of the documentation in nearish future as well. So a lot of that's going to get cleaned up as a matter of that course as well, Scott, but I don't know if they've got an action item or anything internally to update the feature matrix with what was released in the new version.
Yeah, I mean, we are planning to, so there is a release that we are planning for, which is 2.2.0. So right now, if you look at our GitHub repo, you will see release candidate tags being added. So we are actually going through a qualification process now. So the plan is 2.2 is going to have the online volume resize. It will actually bring in all the features that we're going to support in 7.0 U2. So all the documentation and everything is basically waiting on that GL release. It will probably happen sometime soon.
So let me get this straight and communicate to our users where the documentation is expected to live. There's 2 potential places. And when we put out a new vSphere release, like 7 update 2, it typically has release notes that address the new features. But independent of that, we've got our CSI driver. So what is the natural home where a user could expect to find these things? Or should it be duplicated in both?
So we are actually asking ourselves that internally quite recently too, is, where does this stuff live? So the current sort of modus operandi is anything product vSphere related is going to be docs.vmware.com, and anything to do with the CSI at all lives in CSI documentation exclusively. So there'll be 2 separate places, and that way, we don't get duplication of information that's incorrect and all that kind of stuff. So if you want CSI information, it'll be exclusively on the CSI GitHub.
I've got a suggestion, and I'm not in a position of authority to make it happen, but it strikes me that it would be great in the release notes for vSphere to at least put a link to the CSI that corresponds with it, because particularly new users potentially don't even know this other channel exists. And if you at least put a link in those release notes, they'd have a fighting chance of discovering it. Sometimes there's interactions too, I know, where a feature gets added to CSI, but it's dependent on something getting enhanced in vSphere itself. So without both of them, they don't work right, or the feature isn't exposed. And once again, I think cross-linking between those 2, I can't see the harm of it other than adding a sentence to the release notes, and it might save somebody a lot of time down the road.
I would concur, because just from a GSS perspective, we work with customers who are either not particularly versed in going to GitHub and looking at those documentations, and they're looking on the docs page for an official VMware, hey, this is where it's at, because they kind of see GitHub as a public area that isn't particularly official. But if we had something in the docs to reference, hey, everything here is VMware official, they would probably understand it a little bit better as well.
Yeah. The other thing that I find with users who are new to Kubernetes is they don't even understand really the mechanisms with open source, which CSI is, in terms of support, and they're perfectly entitled, if they bought a commercial product, to go through the let me call it the legacy means of support, which is to engage with some vendor. But the fact of the matter is that working as a developer for a couple of decades, I know that that legacy mode usually routes through a tier of different levels of support who typically don't know quite as much as developers, and really going at the GitHub sometimes gets more educated eyeballs on your issue quicker, whether users know it or not. So this is almost like a coaching issue where an astute user might be able to take advantage of both channels. It can't hurt. And you don't usually have the gatekeeper between you, the user, and the developer when you go in there with GitHub issues. And I don't know, if it were me in the shoes of that user, I would certainly be eager to take advantage of the GitHub issue channel. But I think a lot of legacy users maybe don't realize it exists.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of that same thing with Harbor as well, with customers. They're very cautious on whether or not to like go to a GitHub where Harbor lives and where the developers work on it to open an issue. They'd rather come in through support and be like, oh, this is the only way I know. As far as like my past interactions is how to get like a feature request or even like a quick answer to something that it might be a common issue.
And just because we do have a lot of users on this call, just the one downside of that might bother some is that if you do go open that issue on GitHub, understand that it is public. So that sometimes there are people who don't even want the world to be aware what they're using in their IT infrastructure. And it's in that case, you would go through the commercial support channel if you want to keep it private, because there's kind of no way to not disclose at least some form of your identity with a GitHub issue. I suppose you could open up an alias GitHub account if you really wanted to go that far, but
yeah, and I think they sometimes see like, issues that might seem impactful to the customer or whoever brought it up go stale, and they kind of see that as like, oh, I'm not getting help. You know what I mean?
And I think the other thing that's important is that just because something is in the upstream doesn't mean that that's going to be in the product, in the commercial offering. And that's where the changes come also. Just because you got it into Harbor, TKGI isn't with the latest version of Harbor ever. It's always going to be lacking back because it goes through its extra validations and extra everything. So if someone needs something in the product, if they're having an issue, if they're using a commercial offering, then sometimes you have to go through the GSS channel because that's where you're going to get a commitment on product versus just on the open source.
Yeah, and just as a note to users on this call, this group operates under the Kubernetes project. So there's been a lot of talk here about VMware commercial product, but this group exists to serve all Kubernetes distributions. So if anybody here is on Red Hat OpenShift or some other Kubernetes distro, this group is here to support you. So feel free to, even if you've heard a lot of talk about vSphere product, we're perfectly capable and willing to support you regardless of whether you're on a vSphere product or, well, on a VMware Kubernetes distribution or not. We're here to support all distributions, including people on pure upstream Kubernetes right out of the GitHub repo.
Hey, thank you, Steve. This is Hemant, by the way. I work for Red Hat. So I don't know if this is a good segue to ask some questions about, like, I was talking to Divyan offline, and one of the things that I have opened a PR to fix is the using the vendor dependencies in every other sidecar and Kubernetes, the CSI driver that is under Kubernetes 6 repo, you would see that the dependencies are vendored. And a while back, for example, EBS CSI driver stopped building actually because somebody yanked the dependency from internet, and we had to kind of scramble to fix it. And the other case is like building a ability to build the the driver in intranet, or like where you may not have full internet access. So yeah, and I have there are some like, what is people thoughts on it? It still requires fixing the vendor checks, but if somebody can chime in.
Yeah. By the way, would you mind dropping a link to those issues you opened in the chat, or put it in the agenda notes doc, just so we have a record of it to follow up later?
Yeah, I
Thanks.
put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
I stuck it into the agenda. That's PR 767. Is that right?
Yeah.
I don't know, Divian or Sandeep, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so we discussed this issue and the PR internally. So looks like we have a plan in Kubernetes to remove the vendor dependency for the sidecar containers and the upstream Kubernetes repository. So
No, I don't think that's necessarily like Zing. I spoke with Zing just now actually after they even told me. It just, I think, yeah, there are no plans to remove any vendor directories from any of Kubernetes sidecars or drivers.
Okay, so we wanted to go through the advantage and the disadvantage of vendoring this packages into a repository. For example, let's say user or a developer want to modify something, instead of updating the upstream dependency, if they start modifying the vendor folder, right? We want to restrict them through some linter checks that they shouldn't be directly updating it, and they should be only updating through co-mod vendor, and we should encourage a user to update the dependency on the upstream repository itself. So those issues are still pending.
Actually, like I have added script in there, and all other uh, uh, repository that use vendor, they add this check so that the vendor directories cannot be modified. So there's and this generally.
So you have that added in the in this PR itself?
Yeah. There's a script called verify vendor.sh that checks if the vendor was modified directly, and we could add it into the pro job, or we could add it as a build process. In like I noticed that in CSI driver, vSphere CSI driver, we're not using Travis, but in other repository we do some simple housekeeping, like like verifying vendor we run in Travis, but we could add this very well to pro as well. So it just
so I don't know if I have your name right, Hemant. Can I ask you, you're in a position, if you're with Red Hat and OpenShift, of looking at a lot of different cloud provider platforms because you target them. Is there some other CSI implementation that you would say did a great job at this that we could go take a look at to, evaluate what's going on with the vSphere CSI?
I mean, for this vendoring, if you see like the GCPs, for example, a good example, and they have obviously vendored it, and EBS is also a good example. But you could say that whatever changes that we are proposing in vSphere CSI driver for vendoring, I myself have made in EBS at some point in time. So, but yeah, the other good example is just definitely GCP or OpenStack Cinder, things like that.
Okay, thank you.
And there are three concerns raised. So one was somebody could modify the vendor, and then there was when you disable the linter check on vendor directory. Yeah, the existing script has to be updated one by one. It's just a little bit of work, and I was planning to do it, but I just wanted to check if that's the work that requires most effort, because it's just, yeah. Sandeep and Divin, is that okay if we add this, given all of that?
Regarding the linter check disabling, looks like I think we need to update the pro repository. There we have some script for the linters. There we may modify that script to skip the vendor directory.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Hemant. By any chance, do you have any other things you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, the one more issue that I was talking with even offline was the vSphere syncer that is shipped with the vSphere CSI driver, and we were like looking into shipping a vSphere CSI driver with OpenShift, and we are thinking what components are required, what components we could, like we could skip or not ship. So vSphere syncer is something that is they've been explained offline. Like if anybody has anything else to add, it pushes the metadata of PV PVC to CNS and helps with allows user to use static provisioning. But if user is not using static provisioning or not necessarily cares about CNS, seeing the metadata of PV PVC in CNS, the driver basically works without the syncer, right?
Yes, but we are also adding some of the features into a syncer. So syncer is kind of a container for us where we are running a lot of other services. So it's better to add a syncer as part of the CSI driver for end-to-end functionality. Because let's say if user want to locate a particular volume is being used by which application pod, and they want to filter out the volumes from the CNS UI, all of that won't be available if the syncer is not pushing the metadata. So for storage admin, it's a component we want them to install.
Okay. And one last question. Sorry, I thank you for adding this. Are we running any E2Es or any tests based on storage vMotion for CSI driver? Because we never supported storage vMotion with the Indri vSphere cloud provider. We are supporting now with this one. And there's just so many failure scenario with storage vMotion. And yeah, we wanted to evaluate, test, and validate that properly before telling to our customers that, okay, this driver supports storage vMotion, now you can go ahead and use it. Is there anything that we should be aware of, like, or yeah? Or any E2Es or any tests that we are running continuously as part of the storage vMotion support?
I don't know the answer to that myself, and maybe I'm assuming this dead air means maybe nobody else does, but we can take a note of this and try to answer that offline.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either, Steve. Sorry.
It seems fair that we should have an end-to-end test case. I mean, if users can trigger it, if it's going to blow something up, we sure like to know and either document it, lock it out, or whatever, or maybe it just works fine. But it doesn't seem reasonable to expect a user to be the first one to ever try it.
Yeah. So with Intri driver, what happens, and it's a issue with a lot of OpenShift customers, is like the customers use a data store which is a part of data store cluster, and they configure it in OpenShift or Kubernetes, whatever, and the vMotion event happens, and then their VMDKs are migrated. Now their PV PVCs, their references are all invalid, so pods cannot start because volume cannot be detached, nothing works, and their like VMDKs are missing. So that is that's a pain with the Intri driver. We had this for years, even though telling customers don't do that, it just, yeah, it kept happening. With the CSI driver, we have this where it works, but I think that to to properly support this, we should have some kind of end-to-end tests, like where we run the test in a storage vMotion enable clusters, we trigger storage vMotion, and we make sure that parts are able to come up properly.
I think Sandeep's probably the best one to comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, I just listened to Hemant now. Yeah, I think the storage vMotion is something that was definitely planned for CNS. But we do have some tests. We also observed in corner cases it doesn't work. So right now, I think it's better we actually don't claim full support for it because like we don't want to end up having an enterprise customer filing a red escalation saying like I migrated, now my volume is gone, right? So I think for now let's be safe and let's say it's when we're trying to work on the corner cases and we'll fix it.
So
I think it works in most of the cases. There is 1 or 2 cases where we have seen some problems. So.
So do you think that when we ship it, we should not claim support yet? So maybe we might have to update vSphere CSI driver documentation as well then.
Yes, in fact, we already discussed it internally. We will be updating it because some of these we discovered recently. So we will be updating our doc. Devin, I think you had plans to update it, or like, is it something?
Only in the VCP to CSI migration, we have listed it as a supported, but looks like those corner cases when the volume is not attached, right? So those things we want to say it over here. So in general, we are not declaring a support anywhere except for the VCP to CSI migration, where we are showing the difference between what we supported in VCP and what we are supporting in CSI driver. So looks like that table needs to be updated to say that we don't support storage vMotion or block volumes.
I mean, we don't support yet. I mean, that's the right term. So it looks like we are making some progress on the vSphere side of things. So hopefully in the next major version of vSphere, we'll probably be claiming support. I just hope so. I'm not sure.
I threw a link into the agenda there for anyone that wants to have a look at issues that tag storage vMotion. There's a couple of issues on the vSphere CSI driver there that are either bugs or asking for it as a feature or whatever.
Can I join this meeting late? Can someone link the agenda doc?
Sure. Sorry, I have a very basic question. How do I get an invite to this meeting? Is it like even I got this meeting invite forwarded? So
no, it's okay. Yeah, it's kind of complicated. Steve, do you remember how you get an invite to this?
Well, the official process should be that you first join this group. So it's a Google group like any of the other groups inside the Kubernetes project. And the reason for joining that group, if you want, you can opt out of the mailing list and you won't get any email spam, although our group sends very few emails. Then the group membership is what's used to gate access to our documents. So as soon as you join the group, if you're logged in under that same Google account you used to join the group, you'll have edit rights to the agenda notes document and any other docs we care to share with the group. The reason we have to gate it like that, like pretty much every Kubernetes SIG working group, user group does it this way, is there are trolls out there who will go there and just for entertainment deface or delete documents. So there has to be some form of access control. But once you join the group, we're pretty much going to put you in trust mode, and then you can get to the group's documents. Then
I think that also gives you an invite, doesn't it? It sends you a calendar invite from there too.
Well, the actual calendar, and let me cut and paste that. To get this in your personal calendar, we don't want to maintain our own shadow calendar. So the Kubernetes itself has an official Kubernetes project calendar that has all the SIG meetings. And let me just see. I'm going to post that in the chat. Anyway, what you want to do is open up the Kubernetes calendar and then just click on, you'll find this meeting in there. And when you click on that link, you can go add it to your personal calendar in whatever form, whether you use Google Calendar or Outlook or whatever. So I just put that in the chat, the link to the Kubernetes community calendar. So that calendar is pretty chatty. So you might want to like open it now so that you can find it for today, but it's a recurring meeting. So you should be able to add it to your personal calendar.
Yeah, I threw the group link in there as well. So for anyone that wants to join the group that you've maybe just joined this meeting from Slack channel or otherwise, go in and join it in there as well. And then there's all the information on calendars and everything in one of the posts that Steve made.
Yeah. And so far we've been lucky, and this meeting has never been occluded by a holiday where we had to cancel. But the advantage of using that official Kubernetes calendar entry is that there's a means for this group to update you. So in the event that an upcoming meeting was to get canceled, that's how you get notice. If you manually create that this is the first Thursday of every month, you don't have really any live channel to the group where we could communicate any temporary change. I know it's common in these Kubernetes SIGs to cancel meetings that come down on public holidays, and occasionally people cancel meetings that conflict with one of the KubeCon conferences.
I have a question if we're done with that. Did that
Yeah, go ahead, Bryson.
Okay, so this is a topic. Okay, so we use this with persistent volumes if we're trying to say mount them only on specific nodes that are in a specific region. Basically, is the vSAN in that zone? Because if it's on a different part of our clusters on a different cluster, then it won't be able to utilize that storage. Does that make sense, Miles? You look.
No, could you say that again? There's too many iterances of the word cluster in there, and I got confused as to which one you meant.
That's true. Okay, so if we have, say, a cluster, a VMware cluster.
Okay.
So we've got several VMware hosts there, and then we have, say, a single vhost, a virtual host that has GPUs that's not inside that cluster.
Okay.
We will have VMs in our Kubernetes cluster that span those two zones.
Okay.
And so we have been setting up tags in the VMware data center level to be able to specify which zone it's in. And then Kubernetes looks at that. We're still using the cloud config. We're on 117. Okay. And then basing that to determine, hey, where can I schedule you? We've been having some issues with, during updates and various things, those tags disappearing.
On the VMs or on the hosts?
No, from the data center and the vhosts.
Okay.
So I guess not the data center, the cluster.
Yeah, the vSphere hosts in the cluster.
The vSphere hosts in the cluster, yeah.
Okay. That definitely shouldn't be the case unless you're like totally just ripping the hosts out and replacing them, or are you like actually just updating them one vSphere version to the next?
Well, we've got some different maintenance things going on. So Jesse's on from our team that handles the VMware stuff. They're doing some like migrations from like a cluster that maybe has two vhosts to multiple vhosts. So in that, I think they're actually like essentially recreating the cluster. So that's probably just something like maybe a migration step, like, hey, make sure whatever tags were in the old one are in the new one.
Right. If you're doing a replacement, the object ID of those hosts changes and the tags are associated with that object. So if you create a new object, it doesn't have the association. So that would be an extra step you would need to do.
But, and I would assume that on those cases, but I'm seeing it in cases that I'm not exactly sure when it's happening. I know that's not happening. We're not doing any hardware migrations in these cases. There are cases where possibly they've been doing some like ESX upgrades. And besides that, I don't know what else would possibly be causing it. But it impacts us, like the PV stays running until the pod gets rescheduled. And then it says, oh, I can't find it. Or you can't, not find it. I can't find a place to, I can't put it anywhere.
Jesse, I don't know, do you have any more details on how you guys are doing vSphere upgrades and whether you're just ripping hosts in and out or actually upgrading existing hosts in place? Or you might just be having lunch. That's okay.
He probably wasn't expecting to have to say anything on here. So
yeah, you're still muted, Jesse, in case you.
It's cool. Bryson, I would say I've never seen tags just disappear like that. So I would say there's probably something in the upgrade process that is either like removing the host from the inventory and re-adding it to the inventory again will cause it to get a new ID. So any operation that removes it from the vCenter inventory and it's added back in again will break, that ID, and then you would have to replace those tags. So any vSphere lifecycle operation that involves messing with the inventory would cause stuff like that.
Yeah, and if you want to queue up a follow-up question in Slack or whatever channel, we'd like to know what update mechanism you're using. So some of them might be, I think the modern one would be the lifecycle manager built into vCenter itself. Right. The prior generation used something called update manager. There is also a technique of updating a host where you might just put install media and physically mount it on the SX host itself. And that is valid and supported. I don't think so long as you didn't kick it out of your vCenter, it won't get re-ID'd. The ones that are problematic are, there's a way to delete a host from inventory, and that's going to get you re-ID'd for sure. If you do a disconnect and reconnect, I'm guessing that wouldn't re-ID you, but I'm not really sure. Maybe Miles, but I think that should be okay.
No, I think a disconnect, reconnect is okay. The ID would stay consistent there, but it would be if it was removed from inventory, re-added to inventory, or added as a new host in any way, that would be where your problem would be.
Another one that might be problematic is if you had a new DNS name, and you're using fully qualified domain name as your host ID, along with a cert, and you gave it a new one for whatever reason, that might cause a re-ID, but I'm not authoritative on that. But I think it might.
Yeah, I think it would as well.
I mean, part of the issue is because of how it affects us, is we may not know it got removed for a long time, right? So it's hard to track down and say, oh, that was because they did an update at this time. And so I don't know if it's because there was an update. Mm-hmm. So if you have any suggestions on how to best track maybe that down.
So how you track it down. It's weird because tags are created at the vCenter level as are categories, and then they're assigned to hosts or any other kind of object. But the event log is attached to the object. So if the object gets deleted, the event log goes with it. So you don't see it get deleted because the object doesn't exist anymore. So whenever, say, for example, a host got taken out and a new host, or the same host got re-added, then it's got a fresh event log because it's got a fresh MOID, managed object ID. So your event log is going to be empty. So all you would see is maybe the very first event in the log was added to vCenter, right? So you could take that as this is the time that it was added to vCenter, and maybe you could just correlate that to that's when these labels went away.
I'm brainstorming here, and unfortunately, maybe it's a legit issue, Bryson, that you can charge us for writing this for you as a user. But I think that it would be possible to write some scripting tools that would periodically crawl through the inventory of all hosts. And if it's the case that there should be none with 0 tags, you could probably flag that, hey, this anomaly has happened where every host here in my vCenter should have a zone tag, and I've spotted one that doesn't. And maybe it would be sort of an alarm warning that something went wrong, and it'd at least give you a clue that you need a cleanup.
That's we've been looking at a little, that, but not just alert on it, like just take action and add it back.
Yeah,
as
and it
possibly
strikes me, I
doing
think,
that.
like I say, if you wanted to put that in as a feature request, that seems totally legit because it's a crazy idea for every customer VMware has to have to write that themselves when it's potentially generically useful. So that strikes me anyway as falling in the category of something that maybe VMware should take on, but I'm not the PM that makes the decision. But still, I'd encourage you, if you come to that conclusion, to just formally submit it as a feature request. And I think we pay attention to those kind of requests.
And maybe
I've
David.
done something similar. I've done
Go ahead.
something similar actually using the VMware Event Broker appliance, which runs just in Kubernetes and is basically just an event-driven automation system. And then what you can do is there's very specific events in which a MRFID would be changed, which is going to be either the renaming of the host or it's going to be a host being added to an inventory, at which case you can send it would automatically trigger an automation that just takes whatever tags exist on the cluster and then adds them to the host, for example. Very easy, and whether it's PowerCLI, Python, or any language. So that's a real easy way to do it. It can be done with Knative, OpenFast, any of the backends out there. It's just a VMware Fling. So it's another open source project that just runs on Kubernetes that can give you an easy solution to that.
That's a really nice idea.
Yeah, that is a good idea. That Fling, I think that's the one by William Lamb and Michael Gash, right?
Yep, that's the one.
Exactly.
I think they blogged about it so that there are secondary sources of information on that.
April 22nd, there's another power session on that as well.
Cool. Yeah. Scott, do you have a GitHub repo with an example, like what you built there, or is it all behind closed doors, that one?
So that one is behind closed doors, but there is a tagging of VMs on the community samples on the, let me get the link here for the Viva one. But there is a whole repo for the community samples of the VMware Event Broker that William put together with all of the different examples in different languages. For example, when a host enters maintenance mode or a new host is added, it would just be piecing together two basically scripts where there's one in there for when a host is added. Someone created one that adds it to a CMDB. And then someone created one for tagging a VM when it gets powered on. So it would just be taking kind of the logic from one and the event from the other and just mixing them together. If you're interested in this, Bryson, more than happy to also just reach out to me on Slack and I can help you with that if you're interested also. But I'll try and get the links here.
This is probably something worth like a topic for one of our upcoming meetings, because I think this could benefit like anyone. So you're saying, I haven't looked at this. It's sitting in the cluster and it's paying attention to what's happening. Sorry, so it's sitting inside of Kubernetes and it's paying attention to what's happening on the vCenter, or is that what's happening?
So basically, Viva it can be deployed either as an OVA or as a Helm chart onto any Kubernetes cluster. And then you basically give it a config map, just pointing it to your vCenter, and it is constantly listening to all events that happen. And then you can create basically scripts in any language you want and tell it, I want whenever a event of VM powered on, run an automation. When a host is host connected, power on. I think it's 35,000 events that it can work on, which is, I think, the new number of VMware events in vSphere. And so it can basically any event in vSphere. So it's not just for this issue, it's for any type of issue that you may have. It can be used. It simply runs on Kubernetes, but it can run, I have it running in my management Kubernetes cluster, but it could run in any Kubernetes cluster or in the OVA, which is just a single node Kubernetes cluster, an easy way to get it up and running.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. Do you know if it would be able to, like, if you have in Kubernetes, you have Prometheus saying you have a node not ready, would that be able to query vCenter and say, hey, the node is like shut down? like it's down, so of course the node's not ready, or like look and say vCenter and say, hey, vCenter says it's running, and so it's not ready. So like there's actually probably a problem from the Kubernetes side versus like the node's just shut down.
So again, what you can do in those cases if you went on the event of power off or shut down, and then based off of that updated Prometheus, basically, you could run an automation anytime a VM is powered off to update it in, for example, your CMDB, or update it in Prometheus to suspend alerts from the alert manager or something on that sort. You could do because you can have any automation run on any event in vSphere through this project.
Yeah, that sounds really helpful.
And just to clarify, Bryson, I think that you specifically mentioned polling, but I don't think that's the way this works. So it's more like it's edge triggered, so it's watching the events get emitted.
Well, I mean, that what he's saying, if it's watching the events, like, and it can I can then update Prometheus. Then when I'm looking at paging for things, then that'll handle that.
Exactly, and it's actually immediate versus polling on an interval where you may still have some false positives during the 5-minute polling or whatever polling you set. This is the event happens, the automation happens, and it's immediately afterwards. So literally your delta time there between it happening and an issue with a fake alert coming out is the time that your automation takes to run. So it's
so the latency is better for an event-driven thing. Also, they tend to scale better as you get enormous, because if you get 10,000 objects, polling can get kind of ugly compared to events that only trigger things on changes.
I have 800 different automations that I run through Viva, and they all have scaled to 0. So it is 0 pods. Well, it's 1 for the Viva appliance, and then everything is on 0. And whenever an event happens, it just brings up the pod and runs my script. So it's a very easy way to be still resource, not to consume too many resources and get these capabilities.
Scott, I would love to see a demo of that if it's at all possible for you to do that at some point.
Definitely. If it's
Miles, another thing we might be able to do is I can try to contact William Lamb.
I already did
and see if he's willing to come to a future meeting.
No, I pinged William and Michael just there and asked if they would be happy to come on and talk about the broker, and then maybe we could schedule
maybe Scott too.
Scott can do the demo. Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah. I know. I originally built for OpenFast, which was the original backing. It's now Knative, but I built originally the Power CLI language integration into OpenFast, and then William took that and put it into Viva, which is awesome. And then put together the project, which Michael built the event router, which is the key component there, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, a time check here. We're at the official end of the meeting, but before we go, I wanted to check something. Miles and I came up with the idea, mostly Miles, of having this bring us your problems. And I want to clarify that people found this to be useful. I think the fact that we were a little skeptical as to whether problems would come here and we'd have a bunch of dead air, but that certainly didn't happen. Can we hear from some users and also from the other vendor? Was this useful? In other words, should we schedule more meetings like this in the future?
I think this is, just here at the end was useful to start a conversation to come up with more ideas of things that we might want to discuss in the future. So I don't know if you want to do it like, we only do this once a month, so maybe every 6 months, and kind of determine what we're going to do for the next 5 kind of sessions, maybe, or at least come up with some of those ideas, and we can adjust those as we go.
That sounds like a good idea to have one earmarked for this. And of course, for any users out there, you can always bring up problems and issues, whether it's in this meeting or in Slack, but having a whole meeting devoted to it seems like it went pretty well this time. So
I think also that I think it went great, and I love this idea. I think that if the idea comes up in advance in the future to do this, if we say every 6 months or whatever it is, to post it out in more forums as well that this exists, because not everyone knows of the user group, but there's the Kubernetes channel in the VMware Slack, in the VMware code Slack, and there's the, there's all different channels that if it was decided in advance and can be posted out there, we may be able to get more users to both join the user group and just to join for that specific session if they have issues. May be helpful as well.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Great idea, because I think the more we have, the better, because often this isn't just VMware people helping each others out, but users helping users. So the more traction and participation we can get on this, the better. Okay, with that said, it is 4 minutes after, so we've gone over an hour. I'm going to call this to a close, but hey, great meeting. Thanks everybody for attending and contributing to this, and we'll see you again first Thursday of next month. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.